There is something about the sublimely simple and the otherwise benign that can become especially terrifying when things go bump in the night. Evil, personified inside an ordinary object. Like the haunted doll. Perhaps a trope of tawdry tales that no longer thrill. Or perhaps a fear that we would rather not address while those dull, lifeless eyes stare at us from across the room. Unblinking, unwavering, unchanging. Watching, waiting, biding their time for the right moment when they will finally come alive and start the hunt. This is Prey by Richard Matheson on STS SPOOKTOBER 2021.
Amelia arrived at her apartment at 6:14. Hanging her coat in the hall closet, she carried the small package into the living room and sat on the sofa. She nudged off her shoes while she unwrapped the package on her lap. The wooden box resembled a casket. Amelia raised its lid and smiled. It was the ugliest doll she'd ever seen, 7 inches long and carved from wood. It had a skeletal body and an oversized head. Its expression was maniacally fierce, its pointed teeth completely bared, its glaring eyes protuberant. It clutched an 8-inch spear in its right hand. A length of fine gold chain was wrapped around its body from the shoulders to the knees. A tiny scroll was wedged between the doll and the inside of its box. Amelia picked it up and unrolled it. There was handwriting on it. "This is He Who Kills," it began. "He is a deadly hunter." Amelia smiled as she read the rest of the words. Arthur would be pleased. The thought of Arthur made her turn and look at the telephone on the table beside her. After a while, she sighed and set the wooden box on the sofa. Lifting the telephone to her lap, she picked up the receiver and dialed a number. Her mother answered. "Hello, Mom?" Amelia said. "Haven't you left yet?" her mother asked. Amelia steeled herself. "Mom, I know it's Friday night," she started. She couldn't finish. There was silence on the line. Amelia closed her eyes. "Mom, please," she thought. She swallowed. "There's this man," she said. "His name is Arthur Breslow. He's a high school teacher." "You aren't coming," her mother said. Amelia shivered. "It's his birthday," she said. She opened her eyes and looked at the doll. "I sort of promised him we'd spend the evening together." Her mother was silent. "There aren't any good movies playing tonight anyway," Amelia's mind continued. "We could go tomorrow night," she said. Her mother was silent. "Mom? Now even Friday night's too much for you?" "Mom, I see you 2-3 nights a week." "To visit," said her mother. "When you have your own room here." "Mom, let's not start on that again," Amelia said. "I'm not a child," she thought. "Stop treating me as though I were a child." "How long have you been seeing him?" her mother asked. "A month or so." "Without telling me," her mother said. "I had every intention of telling you." Amelia's head was starting to throb. "I will not get a headache," she told herself. She looked at the doll. They seemed to be glaring at her. "He's a nice man, Mom," she said. Her mother didn't speak. Amelia felt her stomach muscles drawing taut. "I won't be able to eat tonight," she thought. She was conscious, suddenly, of huddling over the phone. She forced herself to sit erect. "I'm 33 years old," she thought. Reaching out, she lifted the doll from its box. "You should see what I'm giving him for his birthday," she said. "I found it in a curio shop on 3rd Avenue. It's a genuine Zuni fetish doll. Extremely rare. Arthur's a buff on anthropology. That's why I got it for him." There was silence on the line. "All right, don't talk," Amelia thought. "It's a hunting fetish," she continued, trying hard to sound untroubled. "It's supposed to have the spirit of a Zuni hunter trapped inside it. There's a gold chain wrapped around it to prevent the spirit from..." She couldn't think of the word. Ran a shaking finger over the chain. "Escaping, I guess," she said. "His name is He Who Kills. You should see his face." She felt warm tears trickling down her cheeks. "Have a good time," said her mother, hanging up. Amelia stared at the receiver, listening to the dial tone. "Why is it always like this?" she thought. She dropped the receiver onto its cradle and set aside the telephone. The darkening room looked blurred to her. She stood the doll on the coffee table edge and pushed to her feet. "I'll take a bath now," she told herself. "I'll meet him, and we'll have a lovely time." She walked across the living room. "A lovely time," her mind repeated emptily. She knew it wasn't possible. "Oh, Mom," she thought. She clenched her fists in helpless fury as she went into the bedroom. In the living room, the doll fell off the table edge. It landed head down, and the spear point, sticking into the carpet, braced the doll's legs in the air. The fine gold chain began to slither downward. It was almost dark when Amelia came back into the living room. She had taken off her clothes and was wearing her terry cloth robe. In the bathroom, water was running into the tub. She sat on the sofa and placed the telephone on her lap. For several minutes, she stared at it. At last, with a heavy sigh, she lifted the receiver and dialed the number. "Arthur?" she said when he answered. "Yes?" "Yes." Amelia knew the tone. Pleasant, but suspecting. She couldn't speak. "Your mother," Arthur finally said. That cold, heavy sinking in her stomach. "It's our night together," she exclaimed. "Every Friday." She stopped and waited. Arthur didn't speak. "I've mentioned it before," she said. "I know you've mentioned it," he said. Amelia rubbed at her temple. "She's still running your life, isn't she?" he said. Amelia tensed. "I just don't want to hurt her feelings anymore," she said. "My moving out was hard enough on her." "I don't want to hurt her feelings either," Arthur said. "But how many birthdays a year do I have? We planned this." "I know." She felt her stomach muscles tightening again. "Are you really going to let her do this to you?" Arthur asked. "One Friday night, out of the whole year." Amelia closed her eyes. Her lips moved soundlessly. "I just can't hurt her feelings anymore," she thought. She swallowed. "She's my mother," she said. "Very well," he said. "I'm sorry. I was looking forward to it, but..." He paused. "I'm sorry," he said. He hung up quietly. Amelia sat in silence for a long time, listening to the dial tone. She started when the recorded voice said loudly,
"We're sorry, your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and dial again. This is a recording."
She replaced the telephone on its table. So much for my birthday present, she thought. It would be pointless to give it to Arthur now. She reached out, switching on the table lamp. She'd take the doll back tomorrow. The doll was not on the coffee table. Looking down, Amelia saw the gold chain lying on the carpet. She eased off the sofa edge onto her knees and picked it up, dropping it into the wooden box. The doll was not beneath the coffee table. Bending over, Amelia felt around underneath the sofa. She cried out, jerking back her hand. Straightening up, she turned to the lamp and looked at her hand. There was something wedged beneath the index fingernail. She shivered as she plucked it out. It was the head of the doll's spear. She dropped it into the box and put the finger in her mouth. Bending over again, she felt around more cautiously beneath the sofa. She couldn't find the doll. Standing with a weary groan, she started pulling one end of the sofa from the wall. It was terribly heavy. She recalled the night that she and her mother had shopped for the furniture. She wanted to furnish the apartment in Danish modern. Mother had insisted on this heavy maple sofa. It had been on sale. Amelia grunted as she dragged it from the wall. She was conscious of the water running in the bathroom. She better turn it off soon. She looked at the section of carpet she'd cleared, catching sight of the spear shaft. The doll was not beside it. Amelia picked it up and set it on the coffee table. The doll was caught beneath the sofa, she decided. When she'd moved the sofa, she had moved the doll as well. She thought she heard a sound behind her. Fragile. Skittering. Amelia turned. The sound had stopped. She felt a chill move up the back of her legs. "It's he who kills," she said with a smile. "He's taken off his chain and gone." She broke off suddenly. There had definitely been a noise inside the kitchen. A metallic, rasping sound. Amelia swallowed nervously. "What's going on?" she thought. She walked across the living room and reached into the kitchen, switching on the light. She peered inside. Everything looked normal. Her gaze moved falteringly across the stove, the pan of water on it, the table and chair, the drawers and cabinet doors, all shut. The electric clock, the small refrigerator with the cookbook lying on top of it, the picture on the wall, the knife rack fastened to the cabinet side, its small knife missing. Amelia stared at the knife rack. "Oh, don't be silly," she told herself. She put the knife in the drawer, that's all. Stepping into the kitchen, she pulled out the silverware drawer. The knife was not inside it. Another sound made her look quickly down at the floor. She gasped in shock. For several moments, she could not react. Then, stepping to the doorway, she looked into the living room, her heartbeat thudding. Had it been imagination? She was sure she'd seen a movement. "Oh, come on," she said. "Ugh." She made a disparaging sound. She hadn't seen a thing. Across the room, the light went out. Amelia jumped so startedly she rammed her elbow right against the door jamb. Crying out, she clutched her elbow with her left hand, eyes closed momentarily, her face a mask of pain. She opened her eyes and looked into the darkened living room. "Come on," she told herself in aggravation. 3 sounds plus a burned-out bulb did not add up to anything as idiotic as... Well, she willed away the thought. She had to turn the water off. Leaving the kitchen, she started for the hall. She rubbed her elbow, grimacing. There was another sound. Amelia froze. Something was coming across the carpet toward her. She looked down, dumbly. No, she thought. She saw it then. A rapid movement near the floor. There was a glint of metal. Instantly, a stabbing pain in her right calf. Amelia gasped. She kicked out blindly. Pain again. She felt warm blood running down her skin. She turned and lunged into the hall. The throw rug slipped beneath her and she fell against the wall, hot pain lancing through her right ankle. She clutched at the wall to keep from falling, then went sprawling on her side. She thrashed around with a sob of fear. More movement, dark on dark, pain in her left calf, then her right again. Amelia cried out. Something brushed along her thigh. She scrambled back, then lurched up blindly, almost falling again. She fought for balance, reaching out convulsively. The heel of her left hand rammed against the wall, supporting her. She twisted around and rushed into the darkened bedroom, slamming the door. She fell against it, panting. Something banged against it on the other side. Something small and near the floor. Amelia listened, trying not to breathe so loudly. She pulled carefully at the knob to make sure the latch had caught. When there were no further sounds outside the door, she backed towards the bed. She stopped as she bumped against the mattress edge. Slumping down, she grabbed at her extension phone and pulled it on her lap. Whom could she call? The police? They'd think her mad. Mother? She was too far off. She was dialing Arthur's number by the light of the bathroom when the doorknob started turning. Suddenly, her fingers couldn't move. She stared across the darkened room. The door latch clicked. The telephone slipped off her lap. She heard it thudding onto the carpet as the door swung open. Something dropped from the outside knob. Amelia jerked back, pulling up her legs. A shadowy form was scurrying across the carpet towards the bed. She gasped at it. It isn't true, she thought. She stiffened at the tugging on her bed spring. It was climbing up to get her. No, she thought. It isn't true. She couldn't move. She stared at the edge of the mattress. Something that looked like a tiny head appeared. Amelia twisted around with a cry of shock, flung across the bed, and jumped to the floor. Plunging into the bathroom, she sprung around and slammed the door, gasping at the pain in her ankle. She had barely thumbed in the button on the doorknob when something banged against the bottom of the door. Amelia heard a noise like the scratching of a rat. Then it was still. She turned and leaned across the tub. The level of the water was almost to the overflow drain. As she twisted shut the faucets, she saw drops of blood falling into the water. Straightening up, she turned to the medicine cabinet mirror above the sink. She caught her breath in horror as she saw the gash across her neck. She pressed a shaking hand against it. Abruptly, she became aware of pain in her legs and looked down. She'd been slashed along her calves on both legs. Blood was running down her ankles, dripping off the edges of her feet. Amelia started crying. Blood ran between the fingers of her hand against her neck. It trickled down her wrist. She looked at her reflection through a glaze of tears. Something in her aroused her, a wretchedness, a look of terrified surrender. No, she thought. She reached out for the medicine cabinet door. Opening it, she pulled out iodine, gauze, and tape. She dropped the cover of the toilet seat and sank down gingerly. It was a struggle to remove the stopper of the iodine bottle. She had to rap it hard against the sink 3 times before it opened. The burning of the antiseptic on her calves made her gasp. Amelia clenched her teeth as she wrapped gauze around her right leg. A sound made her twist towards the door. She saw the knife blade being jabbed beneath it. It's trying to stab my feet, she thought. It thinks I'm standing there. She felt unreal to be considering its thoughts. This is he who kills. The scroll flashed suddenly across her mind. He is a deadly hunter. Amelia stared at the poking knife blade. God, she thought. Hastily, she bandaged both her legs, then stood and, looking in the mirror, cleaned the blood from her neck with a wash rag. She swabbed some iodine along the edges of the gash, hissing at the fiery Pam. She whirled at the new sound, heartbeat leaping. Stepping to the door, she leaned down, listening hard. There was a faint metallic noise inside the knob. The doll was trying to unlock it. Amelia backed off slowly, staring at the knob. She tried to visualize the doll. Was it hanging from the knob by one arm, using the other to probe inside the knob lock with a knife? The vision was insane. She felt an icy prickling on the back of her neck. I mustn't let it in, she thought. A hoarse cry pulled her lips back as the doorknob button popped out. Reaching out impulsively, she dragged a bath towel off its rack. The doorknob turned. The latch clicked free. The door began to open. Suddenly, the doll came darting in. It moved so quickly that its figure blurred before Amelia's eyes. She swung the towel down hard as though it were a huge bug rushing at her. The doll was knocked against the wall. Amelia heaved the towel on top of it and lurched across the floor, gasping at the pain in her ankle. Flinging open the door, she lunged into the bedroom. She was almost to the hall door when her ankle gave. She pitched across the carpet with a cry of shock. There was a noise behind her. Twisting around, she saw the doll come running through the bathroom doorway like a jumping spider. She saw the knife blade glinting in the light. Then the doll was in the shadows, coming at her fast. Amelia scrambled back. She glanced over her shoulder, saw the closet, and backed into its darkness, clawing for the doorknob. Pain again. An icy slashing at her foot. Amelia screamed and heaved back. Reaching up, she yanked a topcoat down. It fell across the doll. She jerked down everything in reach. The doll was buried under a mound of blouses, skirts, and dresses. Amelia pitched across the moving pile of clothes. She forced herself to stand and limped into the hall as quickly as she could. The sound of thrashing underneath the clothes faded from her hearing. She hobbled to the door. Unlocking it, she pulled the knob. The door was held. Amelia reached up quickly to the bolt. It had been shot. She tried to pull it free, but it wouldn't budge. She clawed at it with sudden terror. It was twisted out of shape. No, she muttered. She was trapped. Oh, God! She started pounding on the door. Please help me! Help me! Sound in the bedroom. Amelia whirled and lurched across the living room. She dropped to her knees beside the sofa, feeling for the telephone, but her fingers trembled so much that she couldn't dial the numbers. She began to sob, then twisted around with a strangled cry. The doll was rushing at her from the hallway. Amelia grabbed an ashtray from the coffee table and hurled it at the doll. She threw a vase, a wooden box, a figurine. She couldn't hit the doll. It reached her, started jabbing at her legs. Amelia reared up blindly and fell across the coffee table. Rolling to her knees, she stood up again. She staggered towards the hall, shoving over furniture to stop the doll. She toppled a chair, a table. Picking up a lamp, she hurled it at the floor. She backed into the hall and, spinning, rushed into the closet, slammed the door shut. She held the knob with her rigid fingers, waves of hot breath pulsing against her face. She cried out as the knife was jabbed beneath the door, its sharp point sticking in one of her toes. She shuffled back, shifting her grip on the knob. Her robe hung open. She could feel a trickle of blood between her breasts. Her legs felt numb with pain. She closed her eyes. Please, someone help me, she thought. She stiffened as the doorknob started turning in her grasp. Her flesh went cold. It couldn't be stronger than she. It couldn't be. Amelia tightened her grip. Please, she thought. The side of her head bumped against the front edge of her suitcase on the shelf. The thought exploded in her mind. Holding the knob with her right hand, she reached up, fumbling with her left. The suitcase clasps were open. With a sudden wrench, she turned the doorknob, shoving the door as hard as possible. It rushed away from her. She heard it bang against the wall. The doll thumped down. Amelia reached up, hauling down her suitcase, yanking open the lid. She fell to her knees in the closet doorway, holding the suitcase like an open book. She braced herself, eyes wide, teeth clenched together. She felt the doll's weight as it banged against the suitcase bottom. Instantly, she slammed the lid and threw the suitcase flat. Falling across it, she held it shut until her shaking hands could fasten the clasps. The sound of them clicking in that place made her sob with relief. She shoved away the suitcase. It slid across the hall and bumped against the wall. Amelia struggled to her feet, trying not to listen to the frenzied kicking and scratching inside the suitcase. She switched on the hall light and tried to open the bolt, but it was hopelessly wedged. She turned and limped across the living room, glancing at her legs. The bandages were hanging loose. Both legs were streaked with caking blood, some gashes still bleeding. She felt at her throat. The cut was still wet. Amelia pressed her shaking lips together. She'd get to a doctor soon now. Removing the ice pick from its kitchen drawer, she returned to the hall. A cutting sound made her look towards the suitcase. She caught her breath. The knife blade was protruding from the suitcase wall, moving up and down in a sawing motion. Amelia stared at it. She felt as though her body had turned to stone. She limped to the suitcase and knelt beside it, looking with revulsion at the sawing blade. It was smeared with blood. She tried to pinch it with her fingers on her left hand, pull it out, but the blade was twisted, jerking down, and she cried out, snatching back her hand. There was a deep slice in her thumb. Blood ran down across her palm. Amelia pressed the finger to her robe. She felt as though her mind was going blank. Pushing to her feet, she limped back to the door and started prying at the bolt. She couldn't get it loose. Her thumb began to ache. She pushed the ice pick underneath the bolt socket and tried to force it off the wall. The ice pick point broke off. Amelia slipped and almost fell. She pushed up, whimpering. There was no time. No time. She looked around in desperation. The window. She could throw the suitcase out. She visualized it tumbling through the darkness. Hastily, she dropped the ice pick, turned towards the suitcase. She froze. The doll had forced its head and shoulders through the hole in the suitcase wall. Amelia watched it struggling to get out. She felt paralyzed. The twisting doll was staring at her. No, she thought. This isn't true. The doll jerked free its legs and jumped on the floor. Amelia jerked around and ran into the living room. Her right foot landed on a shard of broken crockery. She felt it cutting deep into her heel and lost her balance. Landing on her side, she thrashed around. The doll came leaping at her. She could see the knife blade glint. She kicked out wildly, knocking back the doll. Lunging to her feet, she reeled into the kitchen, whirled and started pushing shut the door, but something kept it from closing. Amelia thought she heard a scream in her mind. Looking down, she saw the knife in a tiny wooden hand. The doll's arm was wedged between the door and the jamb. Amelia shoved against the door with all her might. Aghast at the strength with which the door was pushing the other way, there was a cracking noise. A fierce smile pulled her lips back, and she pushed berserkedly at the door. The screaming in her mind grew louder, drowning out the sound of the splintering wood. The knife blade sagged. Amelia dropped to her knees and tugged at it. She pulled the knife into the kitchen, seeing the wooden hand and wrist fall from the handle of the knife. With a gagging sound, she struggled to her feet and dropped the knife into the sink. The door slammed hard against her side. The door rushed in. Amelia jerked away from it. Picking up the chair, she slung it towards the doll. It jumped aside, then ran around the fallen chair. Amelia snatched the pan of water off the stove and hurled it down. The pan clanged loudly on the floor, spraying water on the doll. She stared at the doll, but it wasn't coming after her. It was trying to climb the sink, leaping up and clutching at the counterside with its one hand. It wants the knife, she thought. It has to have its weapon. She knew abruptly what to do. Stepping over to the stove, she pulled down the broiler door and twisted the knob on all the way. She heard the puffing detonation of the gas as she turned to grab the doll. She cried out as the doll began to kick and twist, its maddening thrashing flinging her from one side of the kitchen to the other. The screaming filled her mind again, and suddenly she knew it was the spirit of the doll that screamed. She slid and crashed against the table, wrenched herself around, and dropped to her knees before the stove, flung the doll inside. She slammed the door and fell against it. The door was almost driven out. Amelia pressed her shoulder, then her back against it, turning to brace her legs against the wall. She tried to ignore the pounding scramble of the doll inside the broiler. She watched the red blood pulsing from her heel. The smell of burning wood began to reach her, and she closed her eyes. The door was getting hot. She shifted carefully, the kicking and pounding filling her ears. The screaming flooded her mind. She knew her back would get burned, but she didn't dare to move. The smell of burning wood grew worse. Her foot ached terribly. Amelia looked up at the electric clock on the wall. It was 4 minutes to 7. She watched the red second hand revolving slowly. A minute passed. The screaming in her mind was fading now. She shifted uncomfortably, gritting her teeth against the burning heat on her back. Another minute passed. The kicking and the pounding stopped. The screaming faded more and more. The smell of burning wood had filled the kitchen. There was a pall of gray smoke in the air. That they'll see, Amelia thought. Now that it's over, they'll come and help. That's the way it always is. She started to ease herself away from the broiler door, ready to throw her weight back against it if she had to. She turned around and got on her knees. The reek of charred wood made her nauseated. She had to know, though. Reaching out, she pulled down the door. Something dark and stifling rushed across her, and she heard the screaming in her mind once more as hotness flooded over her and into her. It was a scream of victory now. Amelia stood and turned off the broiler. She took a pair of ice tongs from its drawer and lifted out the blackened twist of wood. She dropped it into the sink and ran water over it until the smoke had stopped. Then she went into the bedroom, picked up the telephone, and depressed its cradle. After a moment, she released the cradle and dialed her mother's number. "This is Amelia, Mom," she said. "I'm sorry I acted the way I did. I want us to spend the evening together. It's a little late, though. Can you come by my place and we'll go from here?" She listened. "Good," she said. "I'll wait for you." Hanging up, she walked into the kitchen, where she slid the longest carving knife from its place in the rack. She went to the front door and pushed back its bolt, which now moved freely. She carried the knife into the living room, took off her bathrobe, and danced a dance of hunting. Of the joy of hunting, of the joy of the impending kill. Then she sat down, cross-legged in the corner. He who kills sat, cross-legged in the corner, in the darkness, waiting for the prey to come. The end.
STS Spooktober is produced in collaboration with Stories Telling Stories and STS Media Group, scaring itself silly at Millhouse Studios in Milton, Vermont, casting around the globe to your frontal lobe, wherever podcasts are found. STS Spooktober is also streaming on YouTube at Stories Telling Stories. Make sure to give us a review wherever you stream our show. We really appreciate it. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Give us a subscribe on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon for exclusive rewards starting at $1 a month or more. And until next time, stay spooky.